So our player is able to be reset. We've got access to some of those components that we need to change with our input. So we're going to go ahead and add the code to do that now. So we're going to add a little space outside of our brackets for the input.keycode or .getKeyDown keycode P. We're going to get outside of those, but inside our controlling ship brackets. And we're going to start with if input.getKey, not get key down, but just get key, keycode.w, and then we're going to step outside of our parentheses for get key, and we're going to add 2 of the vertical lines, and that means or in programming. And it's important to recognize that these characters are actually going to be above the enter key on the right side of your keyboard. And to use them, you hold shift and then press that button. If you don't hold shift, you'll get these slashes, and that's not going to work. We need those 2 vertical lines. So hold shift and press that button to do that. Next, we're going to say input.getKey keycode.s. So that's going to be if we're moving forward or backward, we want this code to happen. So we'll add our curly brackets. And again, this 2 means or. So if we're pressing W or we're pressing S, where you want to do some code. And all we're going to do here is say anim.setBool walk inside quotation marks. That's important. We want to make sure walk is inside those quotation marks. And we're going to say true. So what that's going to do is set our animator, that bool that we made a couple steps ago, we're going to set the walk Boolean to true. And then outside of our parentheses here, you can click right next to the close parenthesis, or no, I'm sorry, not parentheses, the close bracket. Click right next to that, press enter, and then type else, and then add some more open and close brackets. So if we're not pressing either of those keys, we want to say anim.setBool walk, again, capital W, and inside those, keep it inside those quotation marks, walk false. There we go. That's going to make it so if we stop pressing one of those keys, we'll go back to that idle animation, just like we set up in the animator. Next, what we want to do is add our code to move our camera when we move the mouse. So we're going to say transform.rotate new vector3. If you remember from a couple steps ago, we want to use a new vector3 because we are creating a vector here. We're going to say new vector3, and inside its parentheses, we'll say 0, comma, input.getAxis, and then parentheses, and then inside quotation marks we say mouse x, and then we use the arrow keys to get outside of our parentheses there, and we add another comma, and then we say comma space 0, and now we add or outside of these parentheses here, we add a multiplication sign, which is if you hold shift and press 8. And then we say multiply that by time.delta time, which, as you remember, is the amount of time that has passed between each update frame. And then we multiply that delta time times our rotate speed variable. And that's going to control how fast our camera actually and our player actually rotate when we move the camera. Next up, we need to assign our grounded player Boolean. So we're going to say grounded player and set that equal to controller.isGrounded, because our character controller, which handles moving our player, also determines whether or not our player is on the ground. So we want to be able to reference that in code, so we do that there. Next, we have another conditional where we say if grounded player and player velocity.y is less than 0. So that's if our player is on the ground. And you'll see in a second that this player velocity variable is going to hold how fast we're moving up and down. If it's a negative value, like it would be here, if player velocity.y is negative, that means we're moving down. So if we're in the ground, or if we're on the ground and our velocity is moving down, we want to stop our movement. So we're going to do that by setting player velocity.y equal to 0. Now we can step outside of the brackets for that if statement and go down a little bit. And we're going to say if input.getButtonDown, and then parentheses and quotations, we're going to say jump. So again, this isn't get key down, this is get button down, so it needs a string, and strings are noted by these quotation marks. So we're going to say if get button down jump, and grounded player. So if the controller is not grounded, then, or if the controller is grounded, then we can jump. So We'll say if that's grounded, add our open and close brackets. We'll say player velocity dot y plus equals 2, which means we're adding to that value. We're going to add a value of mathf dot square root, or sqrt, jump height, so that's that variable we wrote earlier. Multiply that times negative 3.0, and make sure you add an f there so we know it's a float. And then we multiply that times our gravity value. So that's going to make it so that we don't have to worry about our jump height's going to properly account for gravity when we press the jump key. What we want to do outside of that conditional, then you press enter a couple times, give us some space. We're going to say player velocity dot y plus equal to, again, this time we're just going to add the gravity value times time dot delta time. And that's because, just like in real life, gravity is always acting on our player. So even if we're in the air or on the ground, we still want gravity to pull down on our player here. And then we're going to add a little more space, and we're going to say if input.get mouse button down, and in the parentheses there, we're going to just put a 0. That's going to mean if we press the left click on our mouse button, our left mouse button there, we want to say anim.setTrigger attack, attack with a capital A. That's going to make it so that when we left click, we actually do trigger that attack motion, which is what we want. And then finally, we're going to add the code to actually move the player. So this, we're going to use our character controller. So we're going to say controller.move with a capital M. And this is a little bit of a longer line, so we're going to do that same enter trick that we used a couple of steps ago. We're going to say move transform dot forward times input dot get axis vertical times time dot delta time, and then finally times speed. So that's going to mean our forward direction times the axis vertical, which is if we're holding W, axis vertical will be a value of 1. If we're holding S, it'll be a value of -1. Multiplying that times time delta time, because we're in update and we want to account for the passage of time there. And then our speed is that variable we assigned in start up here. So we're going to say if, we're going to move that. That's going to handle moving us forward and back. We're going to hit space and plus. And then right after the plus thing, we're not going to hit space again. We're actually going to hit enter so that we can see everything in one, good chunk here. Next, we're going to write transform.write times input.get axis. And then same thing as we did up there, but this time we'll write horizontal because this is going to handle moving us side to side. We're going to multiply that times sideways speed and multiply that times time delta time. So that'll handle moving us side to side if we're holding the A or D key. Because in the same vein, this is 1 if you're holding D and left, or -1 if you're holding A. And then finally down here, we're going to add player velocity times time dot delta time. And that player velocity variable, again, is going to handle if we're moving up or down, if we're jumping, if we're falling. That's going to tell the character controller that we're moving in one of those directions. And then, of course, before you switch back over to Unity and test this by hitting the play button, make sure you save. Control S or hit the buttons up here. Make sure you're doing that after every step so that you never have to worry about losing your work or something not working when you wrote the code properly. And before we move on to the next step, we want to make sure that we go back over to Unity and we click on our player prior, and we're going to add two things. We're going to drag our player script over into the inspector. So we have our player script here. And we're going to click add component. And we're going to click, when we click add component, there's a search bar at the top. We're going to type Capsule Collider. And that's going to add a collider to our player that will allow us to handle collisions and stuff. You'll see when you add it, it's this bottom one. It's got a radius of 0.1. It's going to look like a little sphere at your feet. We actually want it to match this other capsule on our player. So to do that, we give it a height of 2, and then we set the center here. It says center. There's X, Y, and Z. We set the center there to 1. That's going to line it up perfectly with our Capsule Collider controller there. And then lastly, we want to actually go into our our player pirate here and select the ship, or I'm sorry, we're going to want to go into our ship here and select the boat respawn, and then drag that onto our boat respawn field in our inspector. So that's gonna make it so our player is fully set up now.